Hello, and welcome to Word on the Reef, a podcast where we take the plunge into one of the world's most spectacular natural wonders, the Great Barrier Reef. Today we're finishing off part 2 of an interview with Hegerl and Di Tarte, which started back in episode 9. So if you haven't already, I highly recommend you go back and listen to that episode first. But to recap, we're visiting Nini Rise, a heritage-listed house in beautiful Bingle Bay, which served as the headquarters for one of history's most significant conservation battles. The house was built by artist John Buist, who, along with the poet Judith Wright and a small group of grassroots volunteers, led the fight to save the reef from coral mining and oil drilling in the 1960s. As we look out over the incredibly beautiful view of the bay, I'd just like to acknowledge the Jiru people as the traditional custodians of this land and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. Last episode, we learned how Eddie Hegerl and a small group of marine science students set up the Australian Marine Conservation Society, then known as the Queensland Littoral Society, or QLS, in 1965. In 1967, they helped save Ellison Reef from coral mining, a battle detailed last episode. But that battle was just the beginning. It was about to get a whole lot bigger. Because while conducting research to save Ellison Reef, the conservationists had also discovered another alarming fact. The Queensland government had already secretly leased more than 200,000 square kilometres of the Great Barrier Reef to companies who intended to drill there for oil. 6 companies with leases, including Shell and Ampol, had already been actively carrying out oil exploration along the length of the reef from the Torres Strait down to Gurry, Fraser Island, off Brisbane, using magnetic and seismic blasting methods, the latter of which we now know is detrimental to marine life. There were even some test wells drilled near Wreck Island near Gladstone and at Darnley Island in the Torres Strait. In those days, the Queensland government was led by the Country Party, known nowadays as the National Party. Party leader Joh Bjelke-Petersen became Premier in 1968, and it came to light in 1969 that Bjelke-Petersen and a number of ministers had undisclosed financial interests in the companies planning oil exploration enterprises on the reef, including shareholdings in one of the oil companies, Exoil No Liability. Exoil had been granted a lease to drill in Princess Charlotte Bay, northwest of Lizard Island, and Bjelke-Petersen was determined exploration of the reef should go ahead. Already by 1968, a partnership between Ampol and Japanese oil company JAPEX had arranged for a self-propelled drilling rig, the Navigator, to travel from Texas in the Gulf of Mexico to Queensland, where it was due to commence drilling at Repulse Bay, just south of the popular Whitsunday Islands, in October 1969. The artist John Buist, the marine science student Eddie Hegerl, the poet Judith Wright, and the rest of their band of grassroots volunteers had little over a year to try and build enough widespread public opposition to stop it. The main problem was they had absolutely no money to fund a campaign.
Well, we were thinking of how are we going to do this? I suddenly thought of why don't we have a car sticker that people could put on their bumpers saying Save the Barrier Reef. And that worked. I think we sold about 60,000 in the first couple of years, and that helped raise money that we could actually do some more field work to elaborate on impacts. You couldn't drive around Queensland without seeing Save the Barrier Reef car stickers.
What other things did you and the others do to raise public awareness and gain political support for this case?
Well, I went on a lecture tour up and down the coast, which was sponsored by Wildlife Preservation Society and local donors that were concerned about the future of the reef. I spoke to any organization that would invite me to speak to them, which included service clubs, even cane farmers groups. I mean, this is like conservative organizations like Rotary clubs, fishing clubs, people who wanted to go out and catch fish and not have dead reefs, and who realized the connection between the reefs and the coral and the seagrass beds. You needed to save them if you wanted to save the fish. So it just required immense amounts of our time being spent talking about it.
As well as giving public lectures up and down the coast, the conservation volunteers held stalls at events such as the Brisbane exhibition. They gathered petition signatures and ran public opinion polls to prove people were opposed to the oil drilling. John Buist worked tirelessly meeting with politicians, unions and business people, and wrote tens of thousands of letters to influential people across Australia and internationally. He urged the Australian federal government into a legal battle to wrest control of the reef from the Queensland government. More and more groups joined the campaign. Every newspaper carried columns of letters, and the eventual number of Save the Reef car stickers sold was 110,000, as more and more people joined the movement. The Queensland government and oil companies responded with their own media campaigns, full of reassurances that the oil drilling would be strictly controlled and safe. Drilling proponents argued that oil was harmless to marine life and seemed anxious to exploit the reef as quickly as possible before any proper impact assessments could be conducted. One of the more outlandish arguments I've read, which was made in favour of reef exploitation, included that the reef blocked waves and it should be mined and turned into concrete to allow North Queensland to enjoy some decent surfing beaches. What were some of the more outlandish pro-drilling arguments you heard?
I think that was one of the sillier ones. I mean, if you didn't have the protection of the Barrier Reef, the Queensland coastline would be damaged much more severely by cyclones.
Some other wild claims from the mines minister was that crude oil actually encourages coral growth.
Yes.
I doubt that he ever had any scientific studies to back up that claim.
No.
And at one point...
They could say anything and it would be reported in the conservative press at the time.
Yeah, well, that would have been entertaining to read. At one point, a mines department geologist claimed that the reef might be suffering from a plague of corals.
Yeah, that was a pretty good one, wasn't it?
We got to get these corals under control. There's too many corals on the coral reef.
Yeah. It could be portrayed as in the public interest. Look, we're going to make all this money out of oil, and we'll make money out of mining reefs for limestone. Won't that be wonderful? They'll supply limestone for the cane fields, etc. So, you know, there were arguments that made sense to a limited number of people. It became increasingly limited as we went around and did lecture tours explaining to people what the impacts would be. And we found that people in some of the sugarcane towns were adamantly against the reef being damaged because, you know, it doesn't take every day of the year to grow sugarcane. So they spent a lot of time fishing out on the reef and wanted to catch fish, didn't want the reefs to be dead.
The mines minister proposed that the only way to save the reef was to rapidly exploit its oil potential by Australian companies before foreign companies could move in and take it all. It was claimed that establishing local oil drilling would make oil prices cheaper for Australians. But evidence from existing oil rigs in the Bass Strait showed the consumer oil price would most likely rise, and most of the royalties would go to overseas companies, while the local tourism industry would pay the price. So the economic argument didn't stack up. So during this time, did you and the other volunteers receive any threats or attacks as a result of being involved in this campaign?
Yeah, they were fairly, sometimes veiled, sometimes less so.
But you were actually threatened by some of the petroleum drillers at that meeting of the exploration industry.
Yeah. Well, they were less than veiled in some of their comments about what they'd like to do to us.
Wow.
And the Littoral Society's phone was fairly regularly tapped as well at the time.
Wow. Incredible. Yeah, I saw an interview with Des Connell who said that he was shaking when he opened the newspaper because he was worried about what the opponents of your campaign would be saying about you.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was a lot of...
I have to say that Des Connell was a person of immense value to Queensland and Australia. Des was an authoritative source who could speak confidently, publicly, and advocate conservation. And I would say our success truly depended on his contributions.
Yeah, absolutely. Did I hear in one of the other interviews that houses were raided as well during this campaign? Or was it mainly just phone tapping that you had?
Oh, yeah, there was a little bit of nastiness on the part of the Joker Peterson government, yeah. I mean, it was something you just had to put up with. If they'd have thrown us in jail, it would have been bad publicity for them, so they were trying to find some reason to do it.
I think, though, it was an interesting time socially, Tanya, because that was the time of the anti-apartheid Springbok football tour. So there was a lot of public dissent, predominantly led through university protests, etc. You know, a lot of people questioning the value sets within Queensland society and the Australian society as a whole. So it came together as that time of pretty intense social conversations that had an environmental theme as well as a social justice theme, as well as the political themes of, you know, are we going to be a conservative country or are we going to be a progressive country?
Wow, what a time to have been alive, hey?
Yeah.
Well, it sounds great, but it felt fairly dangerous at the time.
Yeah, I can imagine. So now the blossoming tourism industry on the reef stood to lose a lot if drilling went ahead and if there were any oil spills, particularly resorts on the Whitsunday Islands, which would be quite close to the proposed Repulse Bay drilling. So what part, if any, did the tourism industry play in helping to fight the oil drilling?
Not much, but there were some people in the industry who were alarmed. And some people in, for example, the amateur fishing clubs in Queensland had an association that, well, their job was to promote amateur fishing, and hopefully sustainability was on the minds of a percentage of the people in the organisation at the time. It grew with time.
Well, one thing that Judith Wright writes about in her book is that Sir Reginald Ansett owned some resorts just north of the Repulse Bay drilling site, which would be affected. But Ansett didn't join the Save the Reef campaign despite being approached by John Buist. John did some digging and found out that Ansett was the fourth largest shareholder in Ampol. Is that right?
Well, apparently I didn't do the digging. I couldn't comment.
But the issue of concern that Repulse Bay would actually impact the Whitsundays has actually now been confirmed in that another piece of work that I was involved in the last few years has actually done the water quality modelling, hydrological modelling, that actually shows that if there is significant contamination in that Repulse Bay, Proserpine River down to the Pioneer, it does come up onto the western side of the Whitsunday Islands in flooding events. So the concern about having oil drilling in Repulse Bay was very, very valid at the time and just confirmed now with the science.
As discussed last episode, in those days, the Marine Park Authority and the Australian Institute of Marine Science didn't exist yet. The only scientific authority on the reef was the Great Barrier Reef Committee, funded by the Queensland Government and tasked mainly with conducting geological surveys, which were, conveniently, helpful for assessing the mining resources of the reef. Studying the actual life that lived on the reef was considered a low priority. What was the GBR committee's stance on the oil drilling, and what assistance did they offer?
Basically, the Barrier Reef Committee was a very conservative organisation. They saw it as bad publicity that would perhaps impact on them personally if they supported conservation. It seems incredulous now, but the scientists don't rock the boat. Scientists should never be seen or heard. They should just produce publications that only scientists read.
Yeah, well, sometimes the same thing happens now because often scientists see themselves as just limited to just doing their research and they don't think it's their place to get involved in campaigning for any particular outcome. But I think science is no use if politicians ignore the science and if the public's unaware of the science. So science is only useful if people speak up and advocate about it. So
politicians will ignore the science if science don't speak out because scientists are considered like boffins. They live in an unreal world, that sort of public image thing that has somehow evolved and doesn't have much truth in it. Although, there are still scientists that don't want to be involved in anything controversial. because, they might get stung and find it hard to get any jobs where they might be employed by consulting firms, etc.
Well, we've had a lot of examples in recent times where there's been a level of criticism thrown at good reef scientists and organisations like the Australian Institute for Marine Science for speaking out.
Yeah.
I think I always like Al Gore's comment of the inconvenient truth. It's, the science community often comes up with a lot of inconvenient truths that we have to come to terms with as a society.
As the fight to save the reef unfolded, there were a number of devastating and widely publicised oil spill events across the globe, which proved to the public that the conservationists' concerns about oil drilling were valid. In March 1967, a huge oil tanker ship called the Torrey Canyon was wrecked off the coast of England, resulting in 118 million tonnes of oil being spilled onto prime English vacation beaches. It was the greatest environmental disaster in maritime history to that date, and the loss of wildlife was enormous, with more than 20,000 seabirds killed. Then, in January 1969, a catastrophic oil spill happened at Santa Barbara in California. The state of California had tried to prohibit drilling, but the US Supreme Court ruled it was federal territory and granted oil exploration leases for the channel. For 10 days, the blowout gushed oil in a slick spreading 25 kilometres, coating the sand with heavy black oil and killing thousands of seabirds. In the subsequent congressional inquiry, a firefighter gave the startling evidence that he had already attended 50 similar blowouts, of which 11 had been from offshore drilling rigs. In 1970, a tanker spewed 20,000 gallons of heavy crude into Tampa Bay in Florida, leaving a foul-smelling slime that overwhelmed beaches and killed wildlife by the thousands. And on the 3rd of March 1970, the first oil disaster in Great Barrier Reef waters occurred. Oceanic Grandeur, a huge tanker bound for Brisbane, struck a rock in the Torres Strait and released oil in a slick 10 kilometres long. Incredibly, Eddie and fellow QLS volunteer Ross found themselves in charge of the cleanup.
Yeah, that was an interesting one because I was merely a research assistant in the zoology department at Queensland University. But Ross Robertson, who was a postgraduate student, we managed to, one of us went on a plane, a military plane. We managed to talk the army into taking us up there and land us there. And Ross and I found ourselves in the bizarre position of running the cleanup operation virtually because the Queensland Premier and politicians of the day all went up there. They appeared on the press saying, "We've got it under control, don't worry, folks." And then they vanished. They got on their planes and went home. That was it. There was no effort to clean it up.
So it was you and Ross just volunteering, helping out with the cleanup efforts?
Yeah. We ran the cleanup effort virtually because the government abandoned it.
Well, didn't the company that owned the boat also run cleanup?
I can't recall there being a meaningful effort. Perhaps there was. I don't remember them doing.
So it was you and some volunteers on some borrowed little boats.
Yeah, borrowed little boats. I got the borrowed boats by going to the pub and talking to some of the locals who had boats. And they said, "Oh, yeah, we'll take you out for a few days."
Wow.
And then we got dispersant. The government managed to fly that in on Royal Air Force planes. I think we got the dispersant. We didn't particularly want to use it, but it was a choice of the full oil spill going onto the reefs.
Wow.
We're trying to stop it further away from the reefs. And it was like two little boats were spraying dispersant on. We weren't happy about spraying it, but we didn't want it to go onto the coral reefs.
Yeah, because the dispersal detergent is also
poisonous. Toxic in itself, yeah. I mean, it was a no-win situation, but it would have been worse had the entire, I think it was 60,000 tons of oil went slosh onto Torres Strait Island reefs. It would have finished off Torres Strait Island fishing and survival virtually of the people up there. And the oil actually came right down the coast, a couple hundred kilometers. We had big currents and tides, and it went into the Gulf and it went into further south.
Don't forget at this stage, we had little experience as a country on any of this. So organisations like now the Australian Maritime Safety Authority didn't exist. Maritime Safety Queensland didn't exist. The whole oil spill response plan, which is now fully in place, and triggers a huge multi-agency response, grew out of these sorts of incidents. So in the late 60s, none of that existed.
Which is why it's even more scary that they were less than a year away from drilling an oil rig and they didn't have any safety precautions in place.
No capacity to respond.
Yeah.
Well, they were just going to leave it all up to you, Eddie. You and Ross were going to have to clean up everything.
They weren't going to do anything. It wasn't, but we were just a damn nuisance. The politicians all arrived en masse, wanted to say everything's under control, don't worry. And then they went home. There was nothing under control. There was nothing happening.
Unbelievable. Well, one good thing to come out of that disaster, though, was that it sort of contributed to the public sentiment. So by January 1970, the social license for oil drilling on the reef was practically non-existent, with overwhelming public support for the Save the Reef campaign. But the final coup de grace was delivered by Queensland Labor Senator George Georges on the 6th of January 1970. What did he announce about the trade unions?
Well, it was the annual conference of the trade unions that was on, and they had decided that they weren't going to do anything that could harm the reef. It was a pretty monumental step because it meant jobs that they weren't going to have. But they led the way, and there were public demonstrations in Brisbane and big marches, and it became a huge public issue. It was in the media constantly, and people were quite alarmed.
Wow, that's pretty incredible. So the unions were ready to impose black bans on all aspects of the oil drilling, which meant the wharves would be closed to the navigator drilling rig, no labour would be available, no services or supplies would be given for the oil drilling. So, and like you said, that meant that they were losing work. So that was a huge step by those.
It was a huge step, but they were absolutely adamant that they weren't going to harm the reef.
Wow. So
we have to thank them. They were socially responsible.
Yeah.
At cost to themselves.
It's so great to see that, it gives a lot of hope when people take steps like that. So, and it worked. Ampol caved in. A week later, on the 13th of January, it announced a postponement of the drilling. And on 14th February 1970, JAPEX terminated its contract with the navigator.
Yep.
So that union black ban, as well as the tanker spill in the Torres Straits, led to a decision by the Queensland and federal governments to hold a royal commission into the possible impacts of an oil industry on the Great Barrier Reef, which commenced in May 1970. So what part did you play in the royal commission?
Well, we gave evidence of what we knew from our experience, and others did too. A good case was mounted that it was not in the national interest to harm the barrier reef.
Yeah, so even once the commission was underway, it continued to be a David and Goliath battle in that the pro-oil side of the commission had virtually unlimited money to bring in lawyers and witnesses, and those of you on the conservation side had virtually no money or resources at all, apart from what you could make from selling bumper stickers, and you were all working on the case voluntarily on top of having day jobs. So how did you manage to accomplish it?
I'm not sure. We survived, but it was very hard. It cost money traveling to different places to speak even, which frequently wasn't covered by the people who invited us. So it was very, very lean times in terms of personal survival.
How did we actually also had some pro bono assistance from lawyers over
Oh, yeah,
here?
we did. We had some very good lawyers who leaped in whenever anyone got started.
The Royal Commission took nearly 4 years, from May 1970 to October 1974, and examined 95 witnesses, including 21 from overseas. The commissioners and their entourage travelled to selected sites throughout the reef. They inspected oil drilling rigs already operating in other parts of Australia, along with onshore processing plants. They produced more than 18,000 pages of evidence. No more comprehensive study could have been conducted. In the end, the conservationists, after facing what seemed like insurmountable odds, were vindicated in that the Commission's findings were almost exactly what your small group of conservationists had been saying all along, weren't they? So what did they find, in short, the Commission, I mean?
That we had to be careful with pollutants in terms of the Barrier Reef.
Mm-hmm.
That we needed to set up a Marine Park Authority, I think was in that.
Well, the establishment of the reef region and the
joint management by Queensland and Commonwealth.
Yeah, and also that oil drilling should not be permitted on the reef.
Yeah, it was monumental at the time. It was certainly a response to the overwhelming public concern. I would say governments had no choice in a democracy. And Marine Park Authority was set up, and
well, we had to get the Marine Park Act first.
We had to get the Marine Park Act. Yes, that was a minor detail. That took a lot of lobbying to make sure that was a meaningfully good legislation and not just window dressing.
Yeah. And so again, Eddie was part of a small group of people who met on Magnetic Island to draft up a framework for what the Marine Park Act should look like. And then it took the Labor Whitlam government coming in to actually enact the Act and make it happen.
The Great Barrier Reef Committee came in and helped a lot with drafting up the Act. So that was when they must have finally decided to get involved.
Yes, they had an involvement in it.
It's known as jumping on a success.
Yeah.
It's following rather than leading, Tanya.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, even when you had a success with the Commission, it's like your work's never done, right? Because you had to still continue following up to make sure that these things would be enacted. And luckily it was successful, because on the 20th of June, 1975, the Commonwealth took over management of the Great Barrier Reef and established the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Act and the world's largest marine protected area. Woohoo! Ending the threat of mining and drilling on the reef for good. And so that means that momentous decision's 50th anniversary will be celebrated next year.
Correct.
Yep.
So, after facing such huge odds in, relatively unfunded, ragtag bunch of rebel conservationists, did you ever actually hope that you would be successful?
Oh, we hoped we'd be successful. We were giving it our best shot, I suppose would be the way to put it. We were optimistic because of the level of public support. I mean, it was pretty overwhelming. And it was support that politicians could not ignore, even when we got a Conservative government in, when Labor had finished its term, and we had
Fraser in, etc.
Fraser. We managed to make progress even in that era because the politicians were not going to go against massive public opinion.
Yeah, this whole case is just another really powerful illustration of people power and how we can achieve
democracy
anything.
Can work.
Yes, it's even more powerful than who has the most money or the highest political office. So a very important message. Just out of curiosity, do you know if the Queensland government did end up having to pay compensation to the oil companies for the losses that they said they incurred during this debacle?
I don't think, I don't remember that one, Tanya.
I don't think they did.
So basically the oil companies, they, accepted that the risk was theirs.
Well, but they didn't like bad publicity either.
Well, they were very bruised by the fact that they got beaten. It's one of the very few instances globally where the oil industry is explicitly excluded from mining, from access to a site. Although subsequent leases have certainly potentially resulted in directional drilling under the seabed of the region. But it really is one of the few places in the globe where they were stopped in their tracks.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
What a monumental win for Australia. Sadly, John Buist, who pretty much started this movement, did not live to see the results of his work, as he died in 1971 from ill health while preparing evidence for the Royal Commission. And his house in Bingle Bay, which had been a significant meeting place for politicians, conservationists and scientists, is now heritage listed. What did you travel there for in 2017? There was a celebration, wasn't there?
It was the 50th anniversary of the Ellison Reef survey.
Yeah.
Did you get to see Ellison Reef again and see if it's still going well today after all these years?
Yeah, we did. We got out to Ellison, and it was nice.
Unfortunately, stopping oil drilling and limestone mining was not the last battle for the Great Barrier Reef. And the organisation you started back in 1965, now known as the Australian Marine Conservation Society, is now Australia's largest ocean protection charity, and it's continuing to fight threats like climate change, water pollution, and overfishing on our reef. So what lessons do you think we can learn from the original Save the Reef campaign, which can help us in our fight to save the reef from the threats that it's facing today?
Well, you've got to be persistent, consistent, and keep at it.
I think the recent gains that AMCS has led on fisheries and more effective management of our commercial fisheries has been incredibly important. We still have a long way to go on improving water quality. That's been a slow and at times frustrating. Despite Eddie's comments early on that the cane growers were in support, once the problems became their problems on their cane lands, then they became far less supportive in terms of important measures to correct that. But the big issue that many of us were talking about, and certainly the scientists from the 60s, 70s onwards, climate change and the impacts on coral reefs in particular of rising sea surface temperatures, that's the threat that is most immediate, that is going to have the most impact, and I think is going to be the hardest to deal with.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one thing that volunteers like yourself and John Buist and Judith Wright and many others showed us is that you don't need to be a scientist, a politician or a powerful business person to make a big difference for the environment. John was an artist and Judith was a poet, and anyone can make a difference for the environment from any walk of life as long as you have a love of nature and a desire to protect it. Would you agree?
Tanya, you summed it up well, but much of this is about the individual taking individual actions and being committed and then having a collective effort. And that's where organisations like AMCS and other not-for-profit non-government are very, very important because they give that point of coalescence. The crucial thing now, unfortunately, I think the big challenge is social media. And there's so much disinformation as well as good information of being able to sort out what is accurate versus misleading. Would be very challenging running big campaigns these days.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is why it's important for people to go to the reputable and respected organisations like the AMCS to get information about the reef, I suppose, because there is a lot of misinformation out there, and we can't just leave saving the reef or anything just up to the scientists or just up to the politicians, because as we've seen from what happened in the 60s,
it takes community concern.
It takes everyone. So if the listeners only take one thing away from today's chat, I hope that it's that we can all make a difference like you all did, but only if we raise our voices together and get involved. And that's why I encourage all the listeners to support the work of the Australian Marine Conservation Society. And it all started thanks to you back in 1965.
Well, me and Ross Robertson and particularly John Buist.
Yeah.
And Judith Wright.
And Judith Wright.
Yes, very much a team effort. So Eddie and Di, thank you so much for your time today. It's been absolutely wonderful being able to chat with you about this incredible part of Australian history. So was there anything else you wanted to say before we finish up?
Yeah. Yes, there is. Get involved in your local community and do things that benefit everybody.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, Tanya.
I hope you enjoyed our chat with Eddie Hegerl and Di Tarte today. If you'd like to learn more about this story, check out the books The Coral Battleground by Judith Wright and The Reef, A Passionate History by Ian McCalman. McCalman is also set to release a biography of John Buist in June this year, so keep an eye out for that. If you'd like to support the Australian Marine Conservation Society and the work it's doing today to protect the reef, visit www.fightforourreef.org.au. Getting involved could be as simple as just signing a petition or joining the mailing list. If you're enjoying this podcast, please subscribe to this series and follow Word on the Reef on Instagram to get notified when it's time for our next adventure. This is a not-for-profit passion project, so if you enjoyed it, please write a review, share, and tell your friends. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please consider becoming a patron for as little as $5 a month over at patreon.com/wordonthereefpodcast. You'll get a shout out, and the proceeds will help towards covering costs like podcast hosting, email hosting, editing software subscriptions, and so on. That's all for now. Best fishes, and see you next time.